I'm going to be talking to Janetta McKenzie, a senior analyst with the oil and gas program at the Pembina Institute, about a new study that she co-authored about the oil sands titled Cash Flow Modeling Shows Carbon Capture and Storage Can Help Meet Climate Goals. So welcome to the interview, Janetta.
Hi, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Before we get started on the study, I want to set a little context here because the Pathways Alliance, which is the association that represents all the oil sands producers, has said that to decarbonize this sector by 2050 will cost $75 billion. And it's asked governments, primarily the federal government, for $50 billion of that. And they expect that 2/3 of the effort will go into carbon capture and storage. So basically, it's $50 billion for the carbon capture and storage. The government has already provided them with $7.1 billion in tax breaks, tax incentives. And what I really want to get at, though, is this is not an industry that can't afford it. This is an issue with the producers of capital allocation. Where do they decide to spend their capital? And right now, there are other calls on that capital. For instance, most of them are spending about 75%, 80, 85% of their free cash flow. They're sending it back to shareholders in the form of higher dividends and share buybacks because they want to keep the investors happy, so the investors will keep giving them capital. They also have an enormous amount of liabilities on their balance sheets, and the provincial government has brought in mandatory spending for reclamation of some of those liabilities. So now they have to spend more on reclaiming old assets like wells and pipelines and so on. So the call for more federal taxpayer dollars to be given to the oil sands operators for carbon capture and storage is really not, we can't afford it. It's we have been choosing to spend our money elsewhere. And that's why I find your study so interesting. So is this a good way to frame the conversation?
Yeah, I think that this context of very high profits in the last couple of years is always something that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at how to allocate public money to those sectors that are bringing in a lot of cash. When we embarked on this study, we wanted to really sort of sail through these murky waters of carbon capture, which is an expensive piece of decarbonization technology, but is probably going to be pretty critical, not just for oil sands, but for other sectors like cement as well, as we move towards 2050. And despite that role that this technology will likely play for high emitting sectors, the economics of CCS have still been pretty unclear and pretty murky. And so what we wanted to do here is shed some light on how the capital and operating expenditures of a hypothetical carbon capture project would stack up against existing regulations, announced regulations, and proposed and existing financial incentives, and kind of how that balance sheet came out for, again, a hypothetical carbon capture project that an oil sands producer could install at a facility. So we had developed a cash flow model using publicly available information to do that, to examine sort of the economic viability or feasibility of two hypothetical oil sands facilities for CCS. I do think it's really important to note that this is, as I said, still a little bit of a very uncertain space. We used publicly available information, which is both limited and shows a wide range of costs to deploy this technology. So we looked at several different cost estimates and created a bunch of different cost scenarios and ran several sensitivities to account for that. But yes, the bottom line is that was what we were trying to do with this model, is shed a little bit of light on what has historically been a very murky area, because this is an expensive piece of technology, probably quite critical for decarbonization, but still the sector is asking for more support.
Now, my understanding of carbon capture is that the technology has to be essentially custom engineered for each project. So you've got, I think it's 22 oil sands projects up in northern Alberta. The collection, the CO2 collection equipment has to be engineered for each one. There'll be a common carbon pipeline, a CO2 pipeline. that will go down, travel from the northernmost project down to just north of Cold Lake, Alberta, which is in the northeast part of the province. And then you have to sequester it underground and make sure that it stays underground. And so some of this technology is already well known. Alberta has a carbon trunk line already. There have been other projects like the Quest project and Boundary Dam. In fact, I think Western Canada is considered a world leader in carbon capture technology and experience with it. But still, there are so many unknowns here. And I mean, when you're, all you have to do is look at pipelines that we've had, Trans Mountain Expansion and the Coastal GasLink, which basically tripled in cost between their budgets and what it finally cost to get the project close to completion. And I'm kind of thinking that, CCS has to be somewhat similar.
Yeah, this is definitely still a nascent technology, carbon capture, not just in oil sands, but across the economy and across high emitting sectors that would use it. There has been more development in recent years in Canada and around the world. Like many of the solutions that we're using for decarbonization, a lot of this didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago, and we are learning as we go. As more and more firms do carbon capture, then other firms will be able to learn from those examples, both in Canada and abroad. Quest is a really great example of this, actually, as most of its annual reporting is available online, is available publicly. It was one of the key sources that we used for this cash flow modeling, because it does allow future developments to learn from history. And we do expect, like with a lot of other types of decarbonization solutions, and as we've seen in, for instance, wind and solar power, that costs will go down as the technology continues to develop. But yes, right now there are still a lot of unknowns. And that is why one of the reasons, in my opinion, that the sector is asking for more financial support is they say that there's a lot of unknowns here. They say they're taking a big risk with technology like this. Our cash flow modeling found that with what's out there already, in particular, the incentives available from carbon pricing system, there's already a lot of incentives to mitigate a lot of that risk from this unknown technology. There are things that we find in our model that government needs to do and needs to finalize, particularly when it comes to providing policy certainty in carbon pricing, which we can talk more about if you'd like. But if you assume that the headline carbon price increases to $170 per ton, which we did in this model, then there is a lot of incentive from those carbon pricing systems.
Yeah, de-risking new technologies is an acknowledged acknowledged as a legitimate policy tool when we're dealing with economic policy and when there are crises that come up like the climate crisis. My issue here, and I raised this in a column last week, is that it's not like this crept up on the oil sands companies. I mean, they've been talking about it since 2008. I was, reporting on technologies that they had developed, like solvent substitution and downhole RF technology to heat reservoirs and make the bitumen more viscous, less viscous, way back in 5-6 years ago. And it seems like the industry has basically dragged its feet. And now that we're in a crisis, and now that the federal government is talking about an oil and gas emissions cap, now all of a sudden there's a big pressure on for taxpayers to come in and subsidize this. Whereas if the industry had done what it should have done, and it could have foreseen much of this, because this is where the trends were going. And I kind of have a lot less sympathy for the industry than I might have otherwise, given the way they've dragged their feet.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been on everyone's radar for a long time. And there is a difference between de-risking new tech and ending up over subsidizing the oil and gas sector, which is not a line that we want to tip over into with when we do things like provide carbon pricing certainty or finalize the government's announced investment tax credit. Ultimately, both in the domestic context, in the context of the federal government's forthcoming cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector, and more globally as demand for oil declines. This is the cost of doing business in the low carbon transition. This is what improves a facility's carbon competitiveness, which will become increasingly important on the global marketplace as demand for that for less emissions intensive fuels increases. And it is also a cost of compliance as Canada implements its own domestic climate regulations. It's like in order to comply with the emissions cap and other regulations as well. So there is a very, very fine line here, especially when it comes to the oil sands sector, between de-risking this technology to kickstart decarbonization in a very emissions intensive industry and over subsidizing that industry and overcommitting public funds. Because that's another key finding that we found in our model, is that these oil sands CCS investments could actually offer pretty compelling private returns under these stacks of existing incentives and regulations and policies. And it's not the government's, and it's not the job of government support to result in very high private returns for companies.
Yeah, I want to talk about this because I raised this in part 2 of the Unethical Oil series on the conventional side. And that is, I interviewed a number of experts. One, Will Ratliff, who has long been in the liabilities management side of the industry for decades. And they made it really clear that when oil companies sit around the table and look at their annual budgets, there's competition for capital. And the industry says, and this is really, it's hard for a non-industry person to wrap their head around it, but they say, yes, we may have a liability. We may have a bunch of old wells, for instance, that need to be reclaimed, or we have greenhouse gases that need to be abated. But if we can't make money on that, too bad. We're going to allocate our capital over to these activities like drilling new wells or expanding our oil sands production that will make us a return on capital, a positive return on capital. And if we can't do that, somebody else is going to have to pay, or just the work, the reclamation work doesn't get done. And it seems like the industry has a hard time grappling with the fact that this is your externality. You have created this. You are responsible for it. If you can't just abate it or stop doing it when it's convenient for you, when it's on your timeline, when capital happens to be available. Nor can you always come back to the taxpayer to bail you out just because you haven't done what you should have done. And anyway, this is when you talked about the economics, that there's a positive return on this for industry, that I think has to be wielded by government when they sit at the table with these companies to say, look, guys, there's been modeling. You can make money with CCS, and you need to change the way you think about your balance sheet.
Yeah, and that is definitely sort of a gap or a vacuum that we're hoping to fill with this analysis. We do find that these facilities can generate returns that are pretty competitive with other investments in the sector. And we used estimates that included transport costs as well, which is another thing that's come up recently in the news when it comes to capturing emissions from the oil sands. They have to be transported and sequestered somewhere. So we do think that this provides again, based on publicly available information, provides kind of a counterpoint to this argument, because when we run this model, we do see those returns, not just like being a cost of doing business and a cost of complying with regulations, but also that you can break even with these big capital intensive decarbonization projects. And that's a crucial piece of information to have. I think it also really underlines, to your point about timelines, it really underlines the importance of forthcoming regulations like the oil and gas emissions cap, especially getting finalized with a target and with a date attached in order to start incentivizing some shovels in the ground on these projects. We've heard a lot about the plans for oil sands CCS, but we still haven't seen a lot of movement forward. And again, we find in our model here that there are critical things the government should do, like provide carbon pricing certainty, not just for the oil sands, but as a matter of providing more policy certainty in the carbon pricing systems. But given that assumption, there is an opportunity to comply with regs, to do it cost effectively, and to do it now. Start getting shovels in the ground now.
Your report makes a really good point that I think is often lost, and it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, which is that deploying carbon capture and storage on the oil sands can improve the industry's carbon competitiveness, but it doesn't eliminate transition risk. Because, we've got the IEA and others, like I interviewed Bloomberg NEF here just last week, and they said, yeah, we think global peak oil demand is going to be like 2029, and peak and decline in consumption will begin in the early 2030s, which then will make markets more volatile, and we'll see lower prices and so on. And that's a transition risk. So even if you install all of the CCS and you bring the emissions down and make the bitumen production carbon competitive, that doesn't mean that you won't be squeezed out of the market because of low prices and because there's too many suppliers chasing not as much demand. And did you find that there has been any modeling about the oil sands companies' competitiveness in a changing market, in structural market change that we're looking forward to after peak oil demand?
Yeah, this is a really good point. And as a sort of aside, we hope to have some work on the carbon intensity of Canadian oil sands producers coming out soon. But for now, what I can say is when we plugged this into our model and in the context of this CCS report, we did find scaling up CCS can significantly cut emissions and improve facilities' carbon competitiveness and carbon intensity. But we also know, like when you look at the net zero scenarios recently released from the Canada Energy Regulator, that emissions intensity improvements need to be very, very significant and in a relatively short time frame. In those scenarios, emissions intensity from the oil sands was improved by something like 90% by 2050. So it's a huge lift. And so doing these improvements, which again can generate pretty positive and pretty healthy internal rates of return, and which can be pretty cost effective and can cut emissions, but they won't eliminate the transition risk facing oil sands facilities. We know that a steep drop in the emissions generated from upstream oil production would be needed. We also know that demand will go down. Installing CCS might not be worth it at a facility with, for instance, limited remaining reserves or with very high carbon intensity, because it might not be justifiable to try and make those competitive in the medium to long term. But ultimately, even for competitive projects where it makes sense to install a CCS project, that stranded asset risk still exists. Projects with longer economic lifespans and lower risk today do eventually face a high longer-term risk of becoming stranded as global oil demand declines and as global oil prices decline in concert.
I want to finish up our interview with some comments about the carbon intensity, because one of the points that Kevin Burns from S&P Global, who I've interviewed for years and years about oil sands emissions, is not all the projects are equal. You may have an average of 69 kilograms of CO2 per barrel in the industry, in the oil sands industry, but you have newer projects with very efficient technologies down at, some of them are 37 kilograms of CO2, which is actually below the North American average, crude average. But then you have these old projects that use, that are inefficient, and they can be up as high as 180 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. And the only reason that, we basically subsidize these things because they're low cost, they're making money for the producers. So they're cost competitive, but they're not carbon competitive. And at some point, the industry has to grapple with this idea that if it's really, really intense operations, there simply may not be a solution for it. There may not be a way to lower emissions down to the point where they're anywhere close to carbon competitiveness. And that just may be the cost of doing business.
Yeah, that's you absolutely cannot paint the whole sector with the same brush. Some facilities are already, as you say, competing on the North American average or performing a little bit worse than a global average. Some are performing much worse. And over time, that risk of stranded assets and those oil demand declines and cost pressures and requirements to reduce emissions could increase the stranded asset risk for those facilities that are already performing so badly on the carbon intensity side of things. And again, that might not be a facility where installing a bunch of CCUS, a bunch of carbon capture, would necessarily make a lot of economic or just practical sense. But yeah, the sector cannot be painted, with the same brush. Some of these facilities, it makes a lot of sense both economically and in terms of improving competitiveness to install the CCS, and others it doesn't. But ultimately, that transition risk and that stranded asset risk persists across the sector. It is difficult. There's no one measure to look at a particular facility and say this is subject to this amount of transition risk. It is very project dependent. It's very facility dependent. But these are all different things that a facility does need to keep in mind. Having said that, again, I'll just reiterate from our study, we do think that once you stack all these things up, it improves the case for CCS at the facilities where it makes sense to do so, which may not be those really, really carbon intensive facilities.
Well, Janetta, thank you very much for this. It's been a fascinating discussion about the oil sands, and look forward to our next chat.
Thanks for having me, Markham. And if anyone is interested on the nuts and bolts of our methodologies, please go have a look at our report on the Pembina Institute website.